Hello, I'm Mike, this is Will, we are the Tabletop Donkeys.
Hello.
And we're going to bring you the complete overview of the collection from Warhammer 40,000 Conquest magazine. So we'll let Will take you over all of the miniatures you get from the magazine, and then we'll go into a discussion afterwards.
So here we are for our whole collection overview, all arrayed on 3 of the battle mats that we got with this. Look from left to right, there's the Spaceport board, the City board, and the Sector Mechanicus board. We also had a small, or half size of these, cargo deck board that was used for the first games that we got. But now we'll have a look in more depth at the miniatures and all the scenery. So, starting with the characters for the Space Marines at the front. In the front row, from left to right, we have the Primaris Librarian, and then we have the 2 Space Marine Hero Captains, the one in Mark IV Power Armour and the one in Cataphracti Terminator Armour. And then we have the Captain in Gravis Armour, the Standard Primaris Captain, and the Primaris Chaplain. Then in the row behind, 2 Primaris Lieutenants, one with a mastercrafted auto-bolt rifle and one with a power sword and bolt pistol. And then the Primaris Ancient, Lieutenant Calcius, the special limited edition miniature from the magazine, and the Primaris Apothecary on the right. And behind the Apothecary we have the 3 easy-to-build Primaris Intercessors, then 5 more Primaris Intercessors from the Dark Imperium box set, and the other 5 from the Dark Imperium box set on the left. Behind them, in the middle, 2 sets of easy-to-build Primaris Reavers. And we have 5 Primaris Hellblasters, again from the Dark Imperium sprues, 3 Primaris Inceptors from the same sprues, and 3 Space Marine bikes and an attack bike with option of hay bolter and multi-melter. And finally at the back, an easy-to-build Primaris Redemptor Dreadnought, a Primaris Repulsor tank, and finally a Space Marine Land Speeder. Then we have the Death Guard collection, starting at the front again with the characters. On the left we have Lord Felthius, the easy-to-build Lord of Contagion, and next to him Typhus, the Herald of Nurgle. On the right, the Dark Imperium Lord of Contagion, a magazine called Lord Gangrus, and the Malignant Plaguecaster. Then behind them, a Biologos Putrefier and a Foul Blightspawn, a Tallyman and a Plague Surgeon, and finally a Noxious Blightbringer from the Dark Imperium set. And we have the Tainted Cohort, the 3 easy-to-build Blightlord Terminators that come with Lord Felthius. And we have the collection of Plague Marines. At the front, there are 2 sets of easy-to-build Plague Marines with champions with power fists and plasma guns, and a Blight Launcher in each squad. Behind them, there's 7 Plague Marines from Dark Imperium sprues, including a champion with a power fist and one with a plasma gun. And on the left, the 2 separate models, there's a champion with a power fist and bolt gun, and a Plague Marine with the Icon of Despair. Behind them, 10 Chaos Cultists, and a total of 32 Poxwalkers. The 12 at the front are 2 sets of easy-to-build Poxwalkers, and the ones behind, 2 sets from the Dark Imperium sprues again. And there are 2 Chaos Spawn, then 4 vehicles. So on the left we have the Myphitic Blighthauler, then the Fetid Bloat Drone, and last of all a Chaos Rhino and the Plague Burst Crawler. So here in this shot is all the scenery that came with the first of our 3 large boards, the Sector Imperialis board, city board, 2 sprues of Riserpan Ruins, which constitutes 1 set, a set of thermic plasma conduits, and a set of battlefield accessories. Then the scenery from the Sector Mechanicus board, 2 Hemotrope reactors, 2 thermic plasma regulators, and the Alchemite stack that actually comes as part of the Galvanic Magnavent, which we'll see the other part of in a second. And in front of all that there are 12 ammo boxes and 9 oil drums, which came with the cargo containers that we got right at the beginning with the cargo deck board, but they're over here. And finally, the scenery that featured on the Spaceport board. The large thing on the left is the walkway from the Galvanic Magnavent. At the back are the 3 cargo containers, which, as I said, we got with the cargo deck board right near the beginning of the magazine. But they also featured on this board when we played those games. There is a complete set of Galvanic servo haulers in front, the 2 smaller tractor units and crane, and then a set of battlefield objectives, which you can see laid out in front of that. We should also mention the gaming accessories we've got with the magazine. We've got 2 card range rulers on the right, one for the Space Marines, one for the Death Guard, and a plastic one that's 12 inches long, 12 dice, and 2 objective markers. Now, there's plenty more things that did come with the magazine that aren't pictured, principally, of course, a large collection of paints and brushes, which we'll talk about in a bit when we talk about the painting side of the magazine. Also, various pieces of printed terrain on magazine pages that were to be removed to be used on battlefields. And also, of course, for subscribers, there were various subscriber gifts, including some clippers and glue and other such things.
So, right off the bat, I think I'll say that the cost savings from this magazine are excellent. As of July 2020, to actually go out and buy all of these miniatures, I worked it out to be about £1,029, whereas if you got it through the magazine, it would be only £509.35, which is less than half of what it would be to buy it off the Games Workshop store. For every issue where you got a model, you are getting a saving. Even the issue with the single bike, and it's particularly good on things like the Primaris characters, any of the vehicles, especially the Plague Burst Crawler, you actually get that for under half price. The Chaos Spawn, getting it for about a third of the price. And the Land Speeder, the Repulsor, especially if you don't bother buying the base for the Repulsor and build your own, you get that for about half price. Typhus.
An early one was Lord Felthius.
Yeah, Lord Felthius and the Tainted Cohort.
Some of the scenery was very good value as well.
Yeah, the Magnavent's pretty good. Hemotrope reactors, actually. They're £30 for 2, and you get that for about half price.
Also, of course, we're not taking into account all the paints that you get with this.
Yeah,
I mean,
but the issues where you got paints, you were actually paying more through the magazine than buying them separately.
Yeah, so the overall cost for the whole magazine run is...
Yeah, £629.20.
Yeah, so for that you get all the paints and stuff as well. Again, if you wanted to buy them separately, they're a bit cheaper.
And also, we didn't pay for the premium subscription, or we just got it through a newsagent rather than subscribing, so we didn't get any of the subscriber gifts, things like the clippers and glue and paint handle and that sort of thing. None of the premium folders or extra dice and stuff you got with that. I'm not sure if the premium's really worth it with Conquest. With Mortal Realms, the Age of Sigmar magazine, if you get the premium subscription, you actually got models from other armies, which I think is a good idea. And those models would actually be more than the premium subscription anyway, but... We did actually get the Silver Templars art book and the Silver Templars painting guide, and we'll do a video on that eventually as well. I forgot to mention that in the actual issue 80 video. Some of the things in this video you can only get through the magazine now. Now that Dark Imperium and No Fear are on for sale, you can't get the Grabbers Captain, the 2 Lieutenants, the Primaris Ancient, the Lord of Contagion with the Plague Reaper, so it's Lord Gangrus, and the Malignant Plaguecaster and the Noxious Blightbringer. You can't actually buy those models separately anymore.
And of course, it's possible they may re-release those, but we don't know yet. And that's
hopefully units will still exist. Also, some of the terrain isn't actually available anymore, or at least the Riser Pattern Ruins, Battlefield accessories, those specific Battlefield objectives, and even the Plasma Conduits. But presumably that's all being replaced with stuff from the 9th edition starter set.
And I suppose it's also worth pointing out that depending on where you are in the world, the magazine is still at different stages. And also that in the UK at least, you can still get back issues of some versions, but some are sold out. So some of these magazines you can buy separately.
From the Hachette Partworks website, you can get some of the back issues. There's Forbidden Planet also sells back issues. I'm not sure what they have available. But I guess the magazine itself is, the production quality wasn't the best. Some of the issues fell apart quite easily, but I think sort of is the point. You're meant to take each apart and file them all together. And other than that, I mean, all the lore descriptions were generally right, and the showcases is quite nice. It's not meant to be an in-depth look at all the minutiae of the... Yeah, it is a good introduction.
It seems like they must have planned it quite well because if you actually add up all the lore over all the magazines, it's quite a lot. They never really ran out of things to do. In fact, if anything, they were sort of scrambling to try and mention all the things they wanted to by the end. We've got quite a lot of different articles.
They covered every faction that you can play as. But I mean, the paint, I can't really complain about the painting guides. I mean, some of them went into depth that I usually don't bother with, like painting eyeballs and that sort of thing.
And of course, it starts off super basic. I mean, if you look back at some of our first videos and you look at the painting guides that came with them, it's like 2 colours per model, and it looks very basic. But actually, when you see where it eventually evolves to over the course of 80 episodes, I think by the end, their painted examples look really quite good. And if you followed this through stage by stage, and hopefully your painting will have improved a lot over that time, and then it should help people to...
And even having stuff like texture paint with the magazine is really good. Stuff like the Nihilak Oxide and the Nobles Rock showing up right at the end, just adding nice little details. I mean, I ended up not putting any on my Death Guard models because they were essentially finished, and the only issue I could find with the painting guides is that they just tell you to paint straight onto the bare plastic, whereas literally every other painting guide they would start with a primer.
Yeah, whether brushed or sprayed, a primer is probably actually quite important, because otherwise the paint will just eventually come off.
If you were following the painting guide from the magazine, you can get Death Guard green and Calgar blue, whatever the...
Yeah, it's not the end of the world to just put a base coat on straight away, but...
You probably need at least a medium layer brush, which I believe you did get with the subscribers, because the starter brushes are absolutely terrible. I believe some people on Facebook said that their starter brushes were just trashed when they got them. They really are very poor quality, which is a shame, really.
Unfortunately so. They're clearly just the cheapest brushes they could get hold of, and that's... If you're trying to teach someone to paint, I mean, sure, they may not have the best brush care when you start, so it's not worth having a really expensive like artist brush or something, but on the other hand, if they can't use the brush because the quality is so poor, then...
Or early on where you have to paint something like the Myphytic Whitewaller with the starter brush, or something painting. I like how everything was in coloured plastic, so even if you don't like painting, you can still just play with the bare plastic and you can tell which side each model's meant to be, which they aren't doing with Mortal Realms, which is slightly disappointing. But
no, totally, and especially, I think lots of people will be playing this, with their children or whatever, and it's nice to have them painted, but it's not necessary unless you're planning to take these models to a tournament. Obviously, I painted my Space Marines as the Silver Templars, and that, of course, is the chapter that was invented for the magazine. So
and we got to see a bit more background of them. It's certainly an excellent magazine if you are completely new, and you basically get everything you need, like including dice and range rules and stuff. Although, one thing is that the dice were pretty poor quality, actually. I got one that was missing paint on half the numbers, and another one that had 2 3s printed on it. And realistically, you probably want to buy more dice and a tape measure, just because the tape measure is much more convenient than the range rulers. The range rulers are useful when you get in close.
And they're also bendable as well, which is nice, because they're easy to bend round stuff to try and measure things.
I do like also that this magazine includes terrain, because Games Workshop did another Partwork magazine in the early 2000s for the Lord of the Rings miniatures game. But that magazine didn't come with any paints or terrain.
No.
It came with tutorials on how to build your own terrain, because at that time Games Workshop didn't really sell very much, but that's not really for everyone. So I do like how this magazine includes paints and terrain, so you can literally just buy this magazine. You don't have to go out to a Games Workshop store and buy any more stuff. I mean, you're encouraged to. But...
And battle mats as well, actually, for that matter, because if you've got a limited budget or whatever, you probably want to spend that on models or whatever. So terrain might not be the first thing some people buy. They're happy with books or cups or whatever, just on the battlefield, and they're not that... Which is absolutely fine. Obviously, you can do that. But the fact that you get terrain with this is nice, and also probably in a sense a good business move from them, because you get the terrain and think, oh wow, this actually looks really good. Maybe I should buy some more.
Oh, and most of the terrain is mostly stuff that you probably couldn't really make on your own.
No, I mean the detail you can get, you have to be an experienced modeler to make these things from scratch. So.
And before we go into depth in each collection, actually go over how the magazine covered the rules.
Yeah.
And I think that early on it was a good pace of teaching you new things. Pretty much every issue you learned something new, even if it was just like auto-hitting weapons. But then it took a really long time for things like command points to be introduced, and I think relics weren't introduced until issue 75 or something like that. Even building your own army was fairly late into the collection.
I think it was issue 65 we learned how to construct an army. Or at least we learned how to add up power ratings. I don't think we...
I think detachments, I think, was slightly up, was after that.
Yeah.
It was about issue 70, I think, is when we learned about battle-forged armies and detachments.
Yeah.
I was going to say, the fact that we only learned about 2 types of detachment with the magazine would have been disappointing for 8th edition, but actually for 9th edition it works out, because in 8th edition you basically want to make as many detachments as you possibly can, whereas with 9th edition you want as few as you possibly can, so only knowing about the battalion detachment is fine. That also ties into why we only had a limited number of command points in the very last games once we got to 60 power, is that with the Death Guard army you could make 2 battalion detachments, whereas with the Space Marines you couldn't.
I mean, it would be most of my power, but...
And your troops are actually pretty good. I mean, they form the basis of your army.
Whereas the Space Marine troops are the thing you have to take in order to have a battle-forged detachment.
Intercessors, I guess, were okay.
Yeah, it got to the point where, particularly with like 40 power, once you've paid for your 2 HQs and your troops so that you can get those extra command points for being battle-forged, you've basically got hardly anything left to spend. Whereas for me, because Poxwalkers and Cultists are so cheap, I can easily fill out a battalion detachment, get all those command points to use the juicy Death Guard stratagems, and still bring some nasty demon engines or whatever I felt like, really.
But, I mean, maybe it would have been better to go for a patrol detachment, but having the extra command points for re-rolls is still helpful.
Yeah, that's it. Its command points are always useful. Of course, the magazine never realised or never deigned to tell us that even long before the magazine that told us about battalion detachments was printed, the command benefits were changed to 5 command points rather than 3, and they never mentioned that at all. I can only think that the magazine was written months and months in advance. For the Death Guard, you'd probably be fine to just use the stuff from the magazine, other than one mistake where in the Codex you can take a squad of 7 Plague Marines for 10 power, which for some reason you can't with the magazine. On the other hand, the Space Marines, one major problem I think with this magazine is that they got a new codex about halfway through it, and the magazine's stuck with the old rules, which I guess makes sense for a beginner's perspective, because you wouldn't necessarily know that they had a new codex. But considering we knew that it was a thing, it's like we are now essentially teaching old rules. well, not only that, of course, the collection in the UK finished in about March, but some countries are less than halfway through. As far as we know, those ones are still using the old rules that are now nearly a year out of date.
And are actually an entire edition late.
Yes, of course, well, a new edition coming out, but also a new Space Marine Codex due in October.
Yeah.
So it'll be 2 codexes behind by the time some editions finish.
I would say these collections, I think, are still pretty good for 9th edition, and even though the rules for 9th edition are slightly different to the ones from the magazine, it's not a big jump to learn them.
Yeah. If you learn to play 8th edition with this, you won't have any trouble switching to the new edition.
But the main issue was the new Space Marine Codex.
Yeah.
And that added lots of new stratagems and new relics that really helped the Primaris units specifically.
Yeah. And just new rules in general that make the Space Marine army more effective. I mean, we'll talk about the overall state of the missions, I guess, in a minute, but if the Space Marines had their new rules, it might have been a bit different.
Yeah, well, we actually kept track of who won each mission. And by the end of the campaign, we'd actually won exactly the same number of games. But most of the wins for the Space Marines are actually in the first half of the magazine. We did actually manage to follow the narrative that was going through the
pretty much, yeah.
Pretty much. I mean, it would have been a bit weird if the Space Marines were doing really well once we got to the industrial map. It's like, oh, we're on the ropes, even though we're winning every battle, and that wouldn't have made much sense. So, because it wasn't particularly fun to play when you go into missions and think you're going to lose.
Yeah, especially the ones where you didn't pick your own army.
Yeah,
just thinking, oh, well, great, I've got these units now.
It was one of the ones where I had like 3 bikes and a dreadnought and a land speeder or something, which again I think makes the Space Marines look worse than they actually are.
Yeah, if you look at the later games, well, once you started choosing your army, we didn't see any games where we didn't have Hellblasters, just because you need those Hellblasters to do stuff.
They're good against Blade Marines.
Yeah, it's not like I'm complaining or anything. Yeah. It's like, well, if you didn't bring them, well, you might as well just not bother.
Well, I also think that the way the magazine might make some units look much better than they actually are, or much worse than them. So I think like early on, the Aggressors and the Reavers were really good when I could hide them behind a cargo container and charge around a corner. But then as soon as we got to the city map, Aggressors are actually quite slow and have a short range. So when they have to foot slog off the board, they just get shot at. And they really only changed once we got the Repulsor, which was right at the end.
Yeah.
And if we were using the new codex, a lot of my units would have been lowered in power cost, especially things like the Inceptors and the Dreadnought, and also using power. So a unit of Scouts is more expensive than a unit of Intercessors, but if you use points, they're cheaper.
And it depends on what you arm them with as well. Which, if you're not familiar with points, it's another way of building your army, and it's a much more finer-grained system. But the fact that the magazine stuck to power as a thing meant that there were certain things I could have done that I might... we already mentioned that the Plague Marine datasheet didn't include the option for 7 Plague Marines for 10 power, which the Codex does include. Had I had that option, I would have used that often. The other thing that stands out, of course, is the Tainted Cohort being only 3 models, but worth 14 power, which is actually the cost for 5.
Yeah, and the other thing is that power is meant to be a sort of midpoint between the cheapest possible version of that unit and the most expensive possible. And for some of the Space Marine units you get with the magazine, you end up actually getting the cheapest possible if you're using points. So things like the Inceptors can also have plasma guns, but you're basically paying the premium for guns you don't get. And the same with the Dreadnought, and the Space Marine bikes are particularly hit hard.
And the Land Speeder as well. I mean, it's technically the same power cost with the Heavy Bolter as it is with all the anti-tank ones.
With a single Heavy Bolter.
Yeah, that doesn't quite work. I guess they didn't introduce points in this magazine, partly because the points costs change annually, really, when they do a review of the points cost of things for competitive play. And so that would be not great for a beginner, because then you know, which version of the points cost do they give you? Actually, to be honest, going with the magazine, they probably would have given us the really original points cost, where all the Space Marines were still really overpriced.
Extremely expensive. Another thing is that the Death Guard is that the fact that we had ammo boxes everywhere. At least with this collection, you don't get anything that allows you to re-roll ones to hit.
No, the Death Guard in their army list can take Chaos Lords, which have a re-roll, which have basically the same aura as the Captain, or a Demon Prince, which again has a similar thing. I mean, if you think about the number of times with the ammo boxes that I was able to supercharge my plasma guns thanks to a convenient ammo box, how many Space Marines did I one-shot with 2 damage plasma guns over the course of this series? If there had been no ammo boxes everywhere, it would have been a lot less. That is a balance issue that they perhaps inadvertently introduced with the terrain feature. I think overall, considering they had to come up with 80 missions, I guess slightly more because there were 2 missions in a lot of them, I think overall they did come up with quite a variety of ideas, and some of them didn't work, and we talked about those when we played them. We said, yeah, this doesn't really work. Like there was the one where you had to destroy the AA guns.
Yeah, where
you could win it in your first movement, or first
win
turn.
by moving and then charging.
Yeah, and you could win before I actually physically didn't have to do anything. And some of them were basically the same mission over and over again, like capture the terrain piece. But nevertheless, they were interesting ideas, and if you were asked to sit down and write 80 missions for a magazine using a limited collection of models, you could do worse, I think.
I do like that they managed to fit in some of the, I don't know if you call them the less interesting units, things like the Scouts and the Cultists and the Chaos Spawn. You know, we had that whole narrative about the planetary governor turning to Nurgle, so you can fit the Cultists in and they get turned into Spawn at the end, and a little side story and thing. And even stuff like the Reavers, those little side missions were quite nice to do, where they actually got to do infiltration, which you wouldn't normally see in a 40k battle. And I would also say that the stratagems you were given with the Death Guard were way better than the Space Marine ones. I mean, Signs of Gilliman's okay, Death to the Traitors is alright, but stuff like Cloud of Flies, again, that might be something that's not as useful in a larger game, because there'll be more stuff to shoot at, but if you have a unit of Plague Marines with Blight Launchers and I can't do anything about it for a turn.
And also their selection of Warlord traits are better. Psychic powers is another thing, of course. There's Death Guard psychic powers there's like 3 that are really good. The Space Marine psychic powers are...
Well, I don't know, I mean, certainly used 4 of them. I think I used Psychic Fortress a few times.
You did, yeah.
Psychic Scourge certainly came into its own a few times.
Might hear is later time than Null Zone. It was Null Zone you didn't use.
I kind of forgot about Null Zone, but it's casting value of 8. It's kind of hard.
Yeah, and they dropped it in the new codex, so that would be another thing.
Yeah, and that was before we had command points as well.
Yeah.
But again, that's another problem with the original Space Marine Codex. The other thing before you have a closer look at each collection is that the Death Guard army you get it's its own force, whereas the Primaris Space Marines are part of a much larger faction. They are good at their one specific thing, but you don't really get the things to cover up for their weaknesses. We ended up with weird stuff like with the Death Guard ironically being more mobile than the Space Marines, when really they're actually one of the least mobile armies in 40k, because the Space Marines were stuck foot slogging.
That's partly because of the models that were included in the collection, which were, to be fair, were basically what was available for the Space Marines at the time when they designed the magazine. Broadly speaking, it's a reflection on the original Primaris range as much as anything else.
I think it does make some of its weaknesses quite clear.
Yes.
Although, since the release of Shadow Spear and 9th edition and the new codex, I think a lot of their weaknesses have been tidied up. Yeah. And I suppose it's also noting that most of the models are actually either easy to build or sort of mono-pose from Dark Imperium, which I think makes sense if you're catering a magazine to beginners. You probably don't want any of the really complex kits, and it also saves you having to write tons and tons of rules for like...
Yeah, the only thing we really got with that was the repulsor, but that was right at the end, so hopefully everyone, the modelling skills were up to the task by that point. And also the multi-part kits you did get tended to be older ones, like the Scouts and the Bikes. Yeah. So they're fewer components, and they're easier to put together. In some ways you saw the deficiencies of some of those older kits. They're just not as good.
The original Scouts particularly didn't go together particularly well.
But everything for the Death Guard, bar the Rhino and the Spawn and the Cultists, is from the Death Guard range that has been released within the last 3 years. So all of that's pretty high quality, and
they
all
still
goes together well.
Hold together pretty well. And I guess we'll have a closer look at the collection. We could start with the Space Marines, I suppose. If you wanted to buy all of it from the Games Workshop store, it would cost £372.50. It would be £169.78 through the magazine, so getting it for well under half the price normally. You basically get one of everything of the original Primaris range, lacking some of the options like the plasma weapons for the Inceptors and the Dreadnought, which if I had the option I certainly would have taken, because they probably would have been better against Death Guard.
Or the different guns for the Intercessors or the Reavers.
Yeah, the alternate bolt rifles.
Yeah.
And the Reavers carbines and that sort of thing. And I would have to wonder if this magazine had come out later after the new Codex and Shadow Spear, if we'd have gotten things like Infiltrators and Eliminators.
All of which in the Shadow Spear box are still single-pose miniatures, so they're not hard to put together, so it would totally fit with the theme of this.
And I guess stuff like the Scouts are old, but they still they fit a role that the Primaris didn't have at the time. And even the Land Speed, I think, has fulfilled an anti-tank role that the Primaris were lacking at the time.
Yes, and one does wonder whether certain units like the Land Speeder were included because they thought, we should probably give them something that can shoot weapons that do more than 2 damage.
And is also one of the cheaper multi-part kits for the Space Marines as well.
Well, yes, as discussed, it's the older stuff, isn't it? The weaknesses of the original Primaris range is such things like a lack of anti-tank firepower, and they have 2 vehicles, one of which is a Dreadnought.
And the Repulsor is an extremely expensive transport option.
Yes, and as we've seen in the last couple of games, either it does well and the Space Marines do well, or it doesn't, and they don't.
Just the lack of anti-tank weapons was certainly a problem in missions where you had the Blight Hauler and there wasn't really a lot I could do with it.
Yeah.
And the only weird thing, they managed to fit it into the narrative, is the Space Marine heroes with the Cataphracti and the Mark IV armour from the Betrayal at Calth board game.
Yeah, which is no longer available. You can still buy these miniatures separately.
And actually they're a really good saving because they're £30 if you buy them. They're a bit of an odd choice and they wouldn't really fit. If you were going for a Silver Templars army, which is canonically an all Primaris chapter, they don't really fit. I mean, no one's going to moan at you if you take them.
Well, we worked it into our narrative anyway, didn't we? We just said it was
they were from other chapters or something.
Yeah, they got destroyed or worked in or something. Or they're just Ultramarines on
loan.
On loan,
Calcius. Yeah, I would say I like the Calcius miniature. Yet another Primaris Lieutenant. And as you mentioned before, things like the Gravis Captain, the Ancient, and the other Power Sword Lieutenant that isn't Calcius, and the Auto Bolt Rifle Lieutenant, you can't buy separately because they were part of Dark Imperium. You could look at this in collection against the Death Guard and say that it's not that good compared to Death Guard. But I think that's not to say that it's a bad collection. It probably would do fine against any army that has low armor or high number of models. I mean,
yeah, some of the models are outfitted to be better against
the aggressors. And the Reavers are being easy to build, hamper them.
Yeah.
Perhaps less the aggressors, because the flamethrowers are really good against poxwalkers. But the other version of aggressors just put out so many shots at a longer range that they're almost better. Probably, again, the only really bad unit is probably the bikes, but I mean, even they got improved with the new codex. And the Death Guard, I think, their collection is overall more balanced. But again, you basically get one of everything. You've got some decent melee and pretty good shooting. To buy all of the models separately would have been £317, I believe. Oh, I don't believe that includes Dark Imperium, actually. So an extra £45. And then it'd be £147 and 81 pence to get them through the magazine. So again, it's about less than half price.
I think it's quite a good starting army if you're starting out. You get a lot of troops, you get all the characters, and you even get Typhus, who is a named character and quite good.
Although again, I think due to the way the collection's worked out, that certain units would look better than they might actually be, like the Plague Surgeon. Obviously, he gets his bonus against Space Marines, but not against anyone else.
No.
Stuff like the Foul Blight Spawn, again, in games where there's not many units assigned, being able to just delete an entire unit is a big deal. But on a big table, like a 6 foot by 4 foot table, where you can just move around him, and the Death Guard's slow speed is just compounded the larger the ball gets.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, and also, like the Space Marines, I think it was also lacking in anti-tank firepower, but that never really became a problem because they hardly ever took the Dreadnought because it was too expensive, and the land speed is made out of tissue paper and tinfoil and prayers to the Emperor.
It's only when you got the Repulsor that it became obvious that actually demon engines hitting on 4s don't always get the work done.
I mean, it took you at least 2 turns of pretty much your entire army shooting at the Repulsor to kill it.
Yeah.
And if I cast Maya of Heroes on it, it made it even harder. I mean, it's not great in melee either. If you were going up against sort of dedicated melee units,
you'd want to stay away from them.
They probably wouldn't do
Yeah, because the Power Fists are all right against Primaris Space Marines. It can crump a couple of them a turn, but
Again, the main issue I had was that I was mostly wounding on 5s with...
Yeah.
I mean, I had power swords here and there, but still hard to wound.
Wounding on 5s, yeah.
And I guess there's slightly weird things like the Icon of Despair. I don't know why you'd buy him on his own, unless he really wanted that model, and not just buy a box of Plague Marines and build one.
Oh yeah, because it comes with the option in the Plague Marine box.
And the same with the Lone Champion. Although the Lone Champion, you could proxy him as a regular Chaos Lord, which we'll probably talk about in the what to buy next.
Yeah. I guess to some extent they had to give you some stuff for the Death Guard, and so those 2 models were something they could give
and there
you.
wasn't really anything else at that point you needed.
No, those 2 guys were near the end.
But I would say the worst unit for the Death Guard you get with this collection is actually the Tainty Cobalt, because they aren't a legal unit. Because Blight Lord Terminators only come in units of 5. A minimum. By the letter of the rules, you can actually take understrength units, but £14 for 3 Terminators isn't worth it.
Yeah, and you're not allowed to bring understrength units in match play. So I suppose it's the 3 easy to build intercessors or Plague Marines or the Reavers. The magazine's data sheets did allow us to take 3 as a minimum unit size, which is absolutely fine for most things. And unless you're playing in something competitive, then I don't see why your opponent would have a problem with that, especially if you're paying the correct number of points for it. So if you're a beginner and you see that and someone says, "Oh, why are you doing that?" and you say, "Well, I didn't know any better."
I didn't think it would be pretty mean if someone showed up to your club with this collection and played with it and they had a unit of 3. It would be pretty mean to tell them to go away.
Well, especially if they know you're a new player and it's clearly your army you've built up, but it's new and it's kind of,
And also, the man with the Plague Spear is technically not even a legal model because he doesn't have a melee weapon, which Blight Lords will come with by default. So they all have at least an axe or a sword.
Yeah. So. Obviously, again, the same applies to the Death Guard, that they're all the equipment you get with models and you can't change them. Not nearly so much of an issue for the Death Guard as the Space Marines. I did quite fine with the loadout that those models had, but there were certain things you can do instead.
Yeah, and the other thing is the Blight Launchers, basically the anti-Primaris gun.
Well, the Blight Launchers are fantastic. Well, they certainly were with this magazine.
Yeah.
And that and, as we said, ammo boxes and supercharged plasma guns all over the place. Because I almost never took the champions that didn't have plasma guns, because why would I not? then they're really good against primary
when you're essentially, normally you'd have to pay points for that, but with power you don't. So
exactly. So that's why we always saw those two champions. And I think the other thing as well is that with the Death Guard collection, that you isn't so much the case with the Space Marine collections. Maybe once you got the Repulsor, this is less true, but that was like the last 3 issues. With the Death Guard army, you can do quite a number of different kinds of army, and they're still effective. So I mean, you would have seen me do Typhus and the Poxwalkers was an extreme example, but you would have seen me do lots of Poxwalkers. You would have seen me do lots of Plague Marines and tough units. Put people in a Rhino and charge up the field with the fast demon engines. I can do sit back and shoot with the Plague Burst Crawler and Plague Marines. There's quite a lot that I can do. Whereas I think with the Space Marines, with the rules that the magazine tells us, certainly, there's certain builds that are effective against the Death Guard and certain ones that just aren't. And it gets a bit depressing when you have to use the same army every game. But overall, I mean, I've been very happy to play with the Death Guard collection. I've found that for the most part it's been well-rounded and with plenty of options available.
And briefly go over the terrain. I mean, for the 3 boards you get, it's a pretty good amount of terrain. And to buy all the terrain separately would have been £244.50, but with the magazine it's £127.84, so it's just over half the price. And you get a pretty good, and you get the objectives and things. And as we said earlier, some of it's not actually available to buy anymore, unfortunately. Although I imagine it would be replaced with equivalent stuff.
But I mean, our boards, certainly for the last sort of 15 games or so, when we had all the terrain bar the walkway, there's plenty on the board. Occasionally we deliberately didn't put some in the corners because we knew the game wasn't really going to happen in the corners or whatever. But overall, there was plenty of terrain, and we got a lot of different setups from it as well.
Yeah, and you can obviously choose. You don't have to use all of it at once. Actually, one change for 9th edition is probably all the rules for all the terrain's going to be completely different.
And actually, the rules they gave us for some of the terrain was a little bit bizarre because it was specific to the magazine and not replicated anywhere else, I think. Yeah. Well, the ammo boxes are one example, but I think there were some things like getting the cover from the servo haulers. I don't know whether that's a thing in the actual rules for those. That was one of the things that the magazine told you, that if you did turn up at a gaming club and was like, oh, this gives this, and someone would say, hey, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Well, where do you get that from? So if you're a beginner, then it might be a little bit of a reality check when you realise that some of the things the magazine says are kind of made up. But
so we get on to our overall conclusion, or this video will go on for a really long time. But I think this is a really excellent magazine for newcomers, basically because you don't really need to buy anything else. And if you were returning to 40k from an older edition again, you wanted to learn 8th, then again, also really good. You get, perhaps wouldn't necessarily find much use out of the painting guides, but certainly the rules would be helpful and the morals. And if you just wanted to start either of these armies or to expand either of the armies, they're both excellent for the magazine. And actually, they're both pretty good armies for beginners as well.
They're not too complicated. The tactics are not.
The Space Marines basically just stand near your officers.
Yeah.
Form a big blob. And the Death Guard is, well, you're all really tough to kill.
Just march across the field.
March across the field. They're fairly forgiving armies, I'll say. It's not like, say, the Dark Eldar or the Eldar.
Yeah, if you make a mistake.
You really need to know how your army fits together.
Yeah. And the Death Guard have a lot of rules you have to remember, and we did forget them sometimes.
Yeah, and especially for all the things like the Blight Haulers, Muzzled Hitting Melee.
Yeah, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and the Space Marines as well. The Space Marines are a really easy army to paint. Death Guard, I would say they're fairly challenging for a new beginner to paint because there's lots of fiddly little details, but it's still mostly green, gold. Yeah. Obviously, these two factions were the poster boys for 8th edition, so it makes sense that they would do it. From the perspective of experienced players, I mean, we can say that the rules, it took a long time for them to introduce certain rules, and perhaps it was a bit confusing at the beginning, where I think 1 week they said that the Power Blight Spawn's gun did a D3 damage, and then 2 issues later it was, it's actually 3 damage.
Probably just an error, though, that's the thing.
But I imagine from a new player's perspective, I think this is an excellent.
Yeah.
The other thing as well is that I think this would have been a better introduction than, say, just buying First Strike, which is the little introductory game. If you bought the first 4 issues of this, that would be £20, whereas First Strike is £25. And First Strike, you get the same models. You wouldn't get any paints. You get slightly more in-depth rules, like you'd actually get their full data sheets. But for paying less money and also getting paints, I think this is a better start than that. I mean, it's expensive to go through the whole thing, but I'd say it'd be better than buying something like Dark Imperium. With Dark Imperium, you just get a ton of models and a rulebook, and you just sort of say, it's like, where do you start exactly?
There's no introduction way in kind of thing going.
Whereas here, where you start with the basic rules, like here's moving and shooting, and then here's melee, and now here is how to work as a squad. And this is better from a start hobbying perspective since you get the paints. I suppose the other thing would be something like the Kill Team box as an alternative to getting someone into 40k.
Yes, which is a slightly different game, but does give you some models and some terrain and something to do, and then you can work on building it into a bigger army.
And the thing is, we did do a video on Kill Team. You can just take the first 4 issues and turn those into decent kill teams.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's going to be it for our recap and look at the collection. So if you like this video, please leave a like and subscribe and all that. Leave any comments if you have gotten this collection or are doing this collection, especially if you're from outside the UK. Tell us how you got on or are going on, and how did you paint your collections? What Space Marine chapter did you paint them as? Did you follow the painting guides? Did you do your own thing? Let us know, and we've been the Tabletop Donkeys, and we'll see you in the What to Buy Next video, which will be out soon.
Yeah, bye for now.